This is an exciting one. It's been barely a year and a half since the last Speed Legend came out, and yet here we are with a brand new one. Today we're reviewing the Head Speed Legend MP 2025. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So it seems like the US Open is when the big three like to release their signature rackets. Last year it was the Wilson RF01, this year it's the Head Speed Legend, and I'm pretty excited to talk about this racket. Obviously the last Speed Legend was identical to the retail one, and I think that's going to be a similar thing here. It's not just a color update, if you want to even call it a color update. This is a full-on new racket compared to the last Speed Legend. So I'm going to treat this like a standard Speed MP review, and yes, I will get the Pro done as soon as possible, although at this point I haven't even played with that racket, so I really can't say anything about it. I also want to talk about Djokovic for a second, because I really hope that releasing this racket now isn't because he's thinking of retiring next year. Last time they released the Speed, the standard retail version came first. I don't think they're rushing this out. I think it's just because the US Open has the eyes of the whole North American market on it, but I am a little worried. Obviously, this last year hasn't been super successful for him, and it's not even a question of winning Grand Slams or not. It's more of a, can I beat Jannik Sinner? Sinner has won their last 5 meetings, and Djokovic has only won 2 of those sets. So if he's starting to think, I can't beat this guy, and all he wants to do is win slams, well, winning a slam probably involves going through Sinner. So I really hope this has nothing to do with him potentially retiring, but anyways, back to the racket. The Speed MP is a racket I rate very highly. You can see that from the tier list I did a couple of days ago, and honestly, this update is more significant than I was expecting. We've kind of known the deal with head rackets over the last several years. Auxetic came out, made their rackets a little bit more forgiving and more muted, and then Auxetic 2.0 was pretty much the same story, just a little bit more intense. Their whole lineup has Auxetic 2.0 now, so logically their next racket was going to have something different, and it just so happened to be the Speed Legend. And if you thought we'd get a design or important spec update, no, this is head we're talking about. This is still the exact same mold as the previous Speed MP. The update is purely technological. It's called Hy-Bor technology. Now there is still Auxetic 2.0 in here, so Hy-Bor is supplementing that. What's interesting is that there's no mention of graphene anywhere on the frame. Up until now, every head frame has had graphene inside written somewhere. So here's what I take from that, and by the way, Head has given us like 0 information on these rackets. Auxetic 2.0 is still in the handle and the throat. Hy-Bor is the new layup technology that replaces Graphene 360 Plus. I've done a bit of research on what Hy-Bor actually is, and it's a hybrid composite material that combines boron fiber and carbon fiber to enhance strength and elastic modulus. So it sounds like it's there to make the racket more stable and also potentially more forgiving on off-center hits because it maintains its resiliency as it flexes. But again, no marketing material on this. This is purely based off of my own research into what Hy-Bor tech is. But you know what? In terms of technological changes, it's actually pretty major, which is awesome because we've been through some very subtle years with Auxetic. But before we get into any playability, let's just finish up with the specs. Like I said, exact same mold. So this is still a 100 square inch 1619 with a 23mm beam, a 320mm balance, and it weighs 300 grams. Now the swing weight has stayed pretty much the same compared to the previous one, which is quite interesting. That had a really high swing weight for a 300 gram 100. This swings at 328 strung with RPM 17. Stiffness, on the other hand, has changed. The last Speed was really soft, 58 RA strung. This one is up at 61 strung. That's a pretty big boost, and I actually only tested the flex after playing with it, and I was pretty surprised to see that it was that much stiffer. We're gonna talk about playability now, because finally there is a lot to talk about with a head racket. This is very different to the previous Speed, especially in terms of ball feel, so let's get into it. This is by far the biggest update to a head racket since the original Auxetic came out, and honestly, it's probably even bigger than that. I instantly felt the difference on contact. Sometimes I need to string the old racket and the new racket identically to feel any difference. Not this time. I'm gonna break feel down into 3 parts. Racket flex in your connection to the ball, sweet spot size and stability, and then finally comfort. Let's start with flex and connection to the ball because this has a super unique feel and I still don't know whether I like it more or less than the previous one, but let me explain the difference. This new speed has this sort of rubbery quality to it in the sweet spot. I almost want to say that it vibrates a little bit when you make perfect contact, but not in the way we think of vibrations in tennis. It's almost like something gets activated when you make good contact. And this is going to be a really weird anecdote to describe it, but in video games, sometimes the controller will vibrate when you do something good. For example, in FIFA, or I guess EAFC nowadays, there's this thing called timed finishing, where you shoot, and then to make your shot even better, you tap the shoot button again as the player makes contact with the ball, or as close to that as you can. If you time that contact perfectly, it improves your shot quality, and to let you know that you timed it perfectly, your controller will vibrate. That's all I could think about while I was playing with this. When you hit that perfect shot in the sweet spot, there's this really unique sort of boom sensation on contact. It's a little bit weird at first, but objectively it's very rewarding, and it's actually kind of similar to the feel on the Gravity Tour. The Gravity Tour's feel is a little more hollow, this feels springier, but they're similar enough in that they have that really well-defined feedback. And yes, this racket also makes a similar booming sound when you catch the ball right. It's very different compared to the previous speed. That racket feels much more standard, I guess is the word I would use. Like, yeah, it was pretty muted because of Auxetic 2.0, but otherwise it was ball in, ball out, and not much else. There's much more to the whole feel experience here, and the most interesting part about it is that it actually feels like the dwell time is longer on the new speed. That's weird, because remember, it's 3 points stiffer, so theoretically it should be shorter, but it's not. It has a much more pronounced flex, and that got me thinking it's kind of similar to what Wilson is doing with their rackets. Whether they're technically stiff or soft, Wilson rackets feel softer than they are because of the layup text that they use that sort of cushion the ball into the strings. That's how they get their sweet spots to be so big and their rackets to feel so stable, and Auxetic did do that to a certain extent, but it's much more obvious now. The sweet spot on this new speed is significantly bigger and much plusher than it was on the previous one, and that plusher feel applies all around the face. You make contact off center, you still feel the frame trying to flex and help you out. The previous speed was stable and quite forgiving because of swing weight, head size, and beam thickness, but it didn't really have that extra flexibility off center. Having that here absolutely raises the quality of your ball on bad shots. So this is point blank a more forgiving racket than the previous one. The question is that actually better? Because sometimes if a racket's too forgiving, it rewards improper tennis. I am basically saying that they've made this a little bit more like a Wilson racket, and a lot of you know that I'm not the biggest fan of those Wilson stabilization layups because they do tend to take away from your connection to the ball. The previous speed has a cleaner feel, no doubt about it. This definitely feels busier, it's a little bit mushy, there's that really unique sweet spot I keep talking about, and the dwell time is longer. But unlike some other rackets where all that kind of blends together and creates an ambiguous feel where you don't know what's in the sweet spot and what's not, everything is still pretty well defined here, especially thanks to that extra boom and vibration it has when you make contact in the sweet spot. That creates a real distinction between what's actually in the sweet spot and when the racket is just flexing off center. In some ways, it's kind of the best of both worlds between the forgiving element of modern layups and the feedback element of classic layups. Now, it's not classic in any way because it's technology that's making it feel that way, but it's kind of nice. I like that feedback it provides when you make perfect contact, and I also like that it's forgiving and plush on off-center hits. It's really an advanced feeling racket. It's well thought out with proper technology and really well developed. It's going to take me a bit of time to get used to it because it is a very unique sensation, but overall I like it a lot, and I also think it helps to make the racket more comfortable. This thing feels softer, more flexible, and more forgiving on the arm than its flex rating. In fact, I think it feels a little bit more comfortable than the previous one. That was a very comfortable racket, but this new layup feels like it soaks the ball up a little bit more, especially again on off-center hits. Now we're done with feel. I know that was a long time talking just about the feel of this racket, but that's the big change and that's what affects the rest of the playability. So let's move on to control. One thing I want to make clear before moving on to power, spin, and control is that this is still a speed. It plays like a speed, it feels like a speed, it swings like a speed, so the differences are subtle. Because of that, I quickly want to talk about the general control experience you have with the Speed MP regardless of the generation, and then I'll talk about those subtle differences. The Speed MP is a jack-of-all-trades racket, which means it isn't all in for any one specific playability characteristic, and that's very obvious with control. It's great for control, but it isn't going to win any controlled awards. The big thing is that it's a very predictable racket that comes from its constant beam combined with its great stability. So when you compare his speed to another 100, like an Extreme or an Aero or even a V-Core, it has a much more consistent feel to it. That's obviously crucial to control, but in terms of noodly soft control or a super precise feel, it's not really that type of racket. 23 millimeters is a little too thick to give you that ultra responsive flex, and obviously 100 square inches with a 16x19 string pattern, it's not going to be a scalpel like a Prestige or a Pro Staff. I'd say that's probably my biggest gripe with this racket. Sometimes when I really whack at the ball, it's just got a little too much behind it, and I wish it was thinner or had a lower swing weight or a slightly smaller head size. There is a lot of racket up in the hoop, and that can just be a little hard to control at times, but that's a sacrifice you know you're making when you go for an all-around racket like this. So in that regard, the control profile on this new speed is really similar to the previous one, and that's to be expected when there's no design update. Now let's talk about those subtle differences. Whether it's improved or not is really going to depend on the preferences of the player swinging it. Because the previous speed has that cleaner feel I mentioned earlier, I actually think it's a little bit more precise, but because this speed has that really unique feel I keep talking about, I actually think that might help players get more dialed into the racket in the long run. Part of the control game is feeling the ball in the strings and using that feel to get connected to the racket, which eventually turns it into an extension of your arm. There is more feedback here to get to that point. It also has a slightly longer dwell time, which again might be hard to believe because it's technically stiffer, but it does feel like this Hy-Bor tech makes the racket grab onto the ball a little bit longer. That doesn't magically turn it into a noodly control racket, but it does give you a little split second longer to control the ball. Just be careful, don't treat this like a Prestige. You won't be pinging perfect flat shots all over the place with this. I was also really impressed with this racket up at the net. It's definitely not quick, it's actually pretty sluggish despite being called the speed, which is always funny to me, but it's rock solid up there. I was digging out some volleys I usually can't hit. But basically, great control. It hasn't really changed all that much coming from the previous one. It really just feels like this new tech has enhanced the control experience, which I know sounds kind of buzzwordy, but that's the best way to put it. The one thing I really wouldn't worry about is mushiness or an over-engineered sweet spot taking away from control the way I have said some other layup technologies do. Yes, at first it might feel like there's a lot going on inside this racket, but it doesn't create an inconsistent launch or a sticky feel, which I'm going to talk more about now in the spin section. Again, the beauty of the speed is that it's good at everything, and whatever it lacks in traditional control and precision, it makes up for in spin. Now, the previous speed was very spin friendly, but I do get a little bit more spin on this new one. In fact, I think that might be the biggest measurable improvement coming from the previous one. And honestly, I was really happy to feel that, because one of the things I was most worried about when I first felt this plusher Hy-Bor feel was that it would make the racket sticky. Stickiness is something I've talked about with certain rackets that are over-engineered and mushy. Sometimes they feel like their strings get caught up during dwell time, which creates an inconsistent launch and an inconsistent amount of spin. That is not the case here. In fact, it's pretty much the opposite, where this Hy-Bor tech almost feels like the spin technology that's in the shift. I actually brought out a shift during one of my hits to see, and sure enough, it's a similar thing. It feels like as the ball is sinking into the strings, it's loading up on spin, and then it comes out with more spin than you would expect. It's definitely more subtle than the shift, and to be fair, I had RPM in this one and Hyper-G in the old speed, and RPM definitely has more snapback, but there's definitely a more plush, spinny feel on this new one. Now, it's most obvious on off-center shots, which is super cool. There's a less obvious drop-off in spin potential when you make contact outside the sweet spot, because the graphite's still trying to pocket the ball rather than the frame just fluttering. So that's a pretty cool improvement for spin, but I quickly have to talk about maneuverability, because obviously racket head speed is super important for spin generation, and this racket is just slow. This is really, really annoying to me, not just because it's called the speed, but also because it used to be fast, or at least noticeably faster than it is now. When the speed was 22 millimeters thick instead of 23, it was way whippier, so you could generate easier racket head speed, and you didn't have to work as hard to spin the ball. Now that this is thicker, it's a 100, and the swing weight is pushing 330, so it's just a lot of racket to bring through contact. When I'm fresh, I'm relatively fine, but when I'm tired, it kind of starts to feel like a sledgehammer. That's maybe a slight exaggeration, but it's definitely not a fast racket like a Snappy 98 or even an aerodynamic 100 square inch frame, you definitely have to work to generate your spin, and if you're lazy and you don't put enough spin on the ball, it can fly on you. There were a few times where I hadn't set up properly and ended up arming at the ball and it just went flying. So once you've got the right technique, yeah, tons of spin potential from the frame itself. The issue is just getting the racket moving, but that hasn't changed coming from the previous one, so if it wasn't a problem then, it's not going to be a problem now. Now, I might whine a lot about head thickening up the speed's beam to 23 millimeters. Honestly, I might make that my whole new personality trait. I really want it to go back to 22, but it's not like they did it for no reason. 23 creates a lot more easy depth and power than 22 millimeters, and that's the other reason why this is such a great all-around racket. Power isn't pure drive high, but it's not very far. This is a very powerful racket, especially because it gives you the confidence to swing big with the consistent string bed and the high spin. So when you get all of those things working together, you can really rip the ball. Power is also another area where this Hy-Bor tech is pretty special, and I'll go back to that springy feel in the sweet spot to explain why it does feel like it adds a little bit of oomph to your shot. When you make that perfect contact and you feel that unique feedback, the tech almost seems to add a small trampoline effect. It's super subtle. This isn't gonna magically turn you into Yannick Sinner, but it does feel like there's just a little something extra there, at least when compared to the last speed. I feel a similar thing on the Gravity Tour when I catch it right, and honestly, it could just be a placebo from the sound that the racket makes, because that is a really satisfying sound. But even if it is placebo, that's already something. That's the whole point of feedback like this, is to make you feel like your good shots are just a little bit better. So even if it's not actually adding power, it is a pretty cool sensation. But yeah, besides the update, the Speed MP is a very powerful racket with plenty of put away power. I know I might complain about it being a little bit sluggish, but that's part of why it's so powerful, which is a pretty normal trade-off. I'd personally take a little more easy racket head speed in exchange for less power and slightly less stability, but I don't think head's ever going back to 22, so maybe I should just stop asking for it. So I think it's pretty obvious that I'm a big fan of this Speed MP, and it's a racket that can work for a lot of people. It's so well-rounded that if you don't really have a specific style, it'll be perfect for you because it can kind of do it all without shoehorning you into anything. But it's also great for those of you who are a little more power spin or control oriented because it complements those very well, but it'll also help you add some variety into your game. One thing I will say about the Speed is that it's not really as easy of a 100 as something like the Pure Drive or the E-Zone. This is a racket that's really in its element when it's swung fast, and it is just a bit harder to swing fast than those rackets. It's certainly not as exclusive to advanced players as the Gravity Pro or, of course, the Speed Pro, but you do want to be a pretty solid intermediate to get the most out of it. Speaking of the Speed Pro, I can't wait to try this racket. I feel like that Hy-Bor update could be absolutely perfect in this frame because whatever little control issue I might have with it could just be resolved with a denser string bed. I also tested the swing weight on this racket and it was 291 unstrung, which means it might actually be lower than the MPs once it's strung. I'll have to test that out, but yeah, I would be all for that. This Hy-Bor tech makes the racket so stable and forgiving that I feel like they could have easily gone lower with the swing weight on the MP. So I'll definitely test this racket out in the next few weeks and get that review out as soon as possible. I'm also just super excited about Hy-Bor technology going forward in all their rackets. It expands the sweet spot, but it's also got that super cool, unique, addictive feel. And I actually think it might be more beneficial in some of their other frames, especially the smaller head sizes. Beckett and I were joking that this could save the Prestige. I don't think anything's saving the Prestige, but I'm sure they're gonna update it with Hy-Bor eventually, so I guess we'll see. With that said, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo the brand new Speed Legend MP or the Pro, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.